Welcome. I'm your host, Malcolm Gallagher. From our BizVision studios in the UK, you're watching the BVTV network. Sometimes I meet a guest and the clock beats me. That guest usually has so much to say that's of real value to all viewers and listeners that I ask for a quick return. Now, since my interview with my guest about his latest book, and here it is, The Carrot and the Stick, many have told me that his thinking is so appropriate for these altered times that we're in. I make no apologies for wanting to talk further about my guest's leadership in the subject of marketing, as it's my firm belief that marketing, especially conscious marketing, is the way forward for businesses. My guest is a professor of marketing economics and business strategy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a faculty fellow for executive programs at Yale University. So let's say hello again to Dr. William Putsis. Hello, Bill, and welcome back.
Malcolm, thank you so much for having me back. It was a pleasure last time. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Pleasure to be here.
I just love you're a born storyteller, aren't you? You know, if Hans Christian Andersen hadn't been born, you'd have taken his place, wouldn't you?
Well, it is funny. I grew up with my dad telling stories. As a former police officer, he would tell all kinds of stories about growing up in New York. And I've told you this once before, but my storytelling actually began in the UK by watching a colleague of mine on a show on Sunday morning at about 8 o'clock on BBC Two, where it was a guy by the name of Samantra Ghoshal, and he was a professor at London Business School, where I was at the time. And he told a story for 30 minutes about strategy and his walk in the woods in Fontainebleau, and that always stuck with me. And so since then, I've always made it a point to hopefully make it interesting for people by telling those stories, because it's usually those stories that stick. Thank you.
Yeah. And you know, in this book, you tell them so brilliantly. That's why I said to you, I'm putting this on my desert island list, you know, but not that I'm going to know when I'm going to get to the desert island with COVID, but it's going to be on my list. You understand that?
Well, there's an old joke of I'm an economist by training about what does an economist do when he or she has a can of food and is stranded on a desert island. Well, economists always assume everything. So the old joke is, well, they just assume they have a can opener. So there you go for your desert island.
Yeah, I've got it. Mine will be a bottle of wine, but don't worry. I'll just have this corkscrew top. Right. I know you're a very busy person and a much sought after speaker. So thanks for giving me this extra time. Now, as I said in my opening piece, your thinking, especially with the carrot and the stick, is totally appropriate for our new and altered world. Not enough companies, though, are awakening to the fact that this new world will be even more competitive than before, and that they really need to be fit to compete. So, viewers and listeners, in this return interview with Bill, I'm focusing on what's important to you today. And that is how to create, develop, and implement a marketing strategy that will ensure that you are fit to compete today. In my three-part chat with Bill, I'll ask him his thinking on the new competitive world. Am I just hyping it, or is it real? And do businesses need to toughen up to win whilst balancing that with a conscious or compassionate culture? In part two, I'm asking Bill to explain how his carrot and stick thinking needs to be applied if it's to be truly successful, and no holds barred on this one, Bill. And in part three, I'm giving him free rein to make you think of what can be achieved if you follow Bill's thinking. In other words, I'm asking him to challenge you, so you'll need pen and paper ready. But first, Bill, can you briefly remind us what the Carrot and the Stick book is about and what you mean by leveraging strategic control for growth?
Happy to, Malcolm. I'll give you the short version of the longest story this time. But the carrot is something I call vertical incentive alignment. It's a fancy term, but the concept is relatively simple. And that is throughout all of your value chain, which is broader than your supply chain. So from design of product all the way through to the afterlife service and support of a product, it's important to have all the incentives aligned of all the constituents internal to the company, your customers, your suppliers. If everyone's doing what's in your best interest, that's where you end up in a much better marketplace in a competitive world of today. The stick is probably even more important today, and the stick is something I refer to as strategic control. And that's an underutilized resource, maybe a patent. It could be a resource that's in short supply. But if someone owns a good portion or all of that one entity, whether it be a patent, a resource, labor, sometimes today it's scale, often today it's data. If you own that, you can then leverage that ownership for supernormal margins and a better competitive position in the marketplace than your rivals. And what we show in the book that I mentioned briefly on our last conversation is that companies, at least in our data set, that apply both of these concepts well, materially outperform those that don't.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I'm really glad as well that you mentioned the value chain being greater than the supply chain, because far too many just stop after delivery, where in its whole life support and things like that are so important to the customer, aren't they?
On both ends, Malcolm. So I worked with a company about 3 years ago, and they work in the supply chain for Walmart. And they actually, the role of what they do is to make sure that a product that's going to go on the Walmart shelves meets all compliance, regulatory compliance, state laws, so that Walmart doesn't get sued because they had a product on the shelves that didn't meet the compliance regulations. And they were a barrier to getting products on the shelf because there was a delay. Someone would get onboarded to Walmart and say, well, no, has this company approved it? And 6 weeks later, they actually get on the shelves and lose 6 weeks worth of revenue. So what they actually did is go all the way back to the design stage and make sure that the design of the product was approved before it ever was created. So when they get to that stage in the onboarding process, they have a code. Yes, already been pre-approved, you fast track. Yeah. So that's an example on one end. And then the other on the back end is, I'll give you another example, which is in roofing. They have the material that comes off a roof in North America, actually by most municipal laws need to be recycled. Yep. So you're done with the product, you've sold it. But you can't get a new roof on and sell more product until you find a way to recycle the product. And that actually had one company that dominated the market that took much of the margin of what you get by installing the new roof off. So here are cases, one before the product is even designed, and another after you've serviced it and it's long after its life, that can control your success in the marketplace if you don't worry about them.
Yeah, yeah. It's so important that people start to understand this new thinking, particularly things like circular economy, isn't it?
Yeah, and you think circular economy is a classic one because so many opportunities are created today after the product is now ready for recycling. Yeah. There are certain countries and certain companies that are leaders, Germany as an example, in the EU with the recycling side, but it's phenomenal what companies do to gain competitive advantage when they realize that circular economy is important, and how many companies are frozen out because they don't.
Bill, let's move to part one. You're thinking on the new competitive world. Now, I'm often told that I'm just hyping change and that we'll all soon be back to business as usual. What's your thoughts here? And where and how do businesses need to toughen up to win? And can they balance that with a conscious or compassionate culture?
So it's funny, there's a term called hyper competitive that's become almost a buzzword these days because so many people use it. The competitive intensity of industries has increased exponentially. What we saw worldwide with the pandemic, it has just accelerated trends that already existed. So if anything, Malcolm, and I might be to the other extreme, I'll argue that as much as you, and I've seen you talk to the pace of change, if anything, I would argue it's greater. So what we're seeing today, and I'll give you a couple fundamental reasons why I believe the competitive environment is even stronger today. Number one, by far and away, is the ability of smaller entities to be competitive quickly vis-a-vis what's happening on the internet, particularly particularly with respect to the connection of businesses on the supply chain side and in the e-commerce side. Think about it. So I'll take two examples I use in the book. One is taxi cabs and medallions. I love taxi cabs in London, but in the US, it was strictly controlled by municipalities. Along comes a small startup, 2 people, basically in a garage, who decided to create an app that you can access a car that someone else owns. Obviously, Lyft and Uber in the United States is what I'm referring to. Yeah. Just by accessing and creating an app. If you view the control of the eyeglass industry, contact lenses, sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses. There's really two firms that control the dominant market share worldwide. And here are two students at Wharton the School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, who decided to start a business to fight them all, called Warby Parker. Warby Parker, now hugely successful, worth multiple billions of dollars. So the idea here in many ways is that the competitive environment has become so intense because if you're large or small, you have an ability to disrupt others or be disrupted if you're existing in the business, in an existing business in ways no one has ever seen before. It's funny, we had a webinar on retailing that we did back maybe 6-7 months ago with the head of Kroger here in the United States and a food marketing policy center, which has a presence worldwide. And the conclusions in the food industry is that all of a sudden those parts of the industry that were more efficient gained significantly during the pandemic, and that for certain isn't going to change. No one is voluntarily going to pay more just simply because supply restrictions have loosened up in some parts of the world. So long-winded way, Malcolm, of agreeing with you wholehearted. What we've seen is an accelerating of the trends in light of the global pandemic. Those trends are not going back anytime soon. If anything, they will increase over time because they can.
And if somebody does the right thinking, as you encourage people to do so in your book, the right thinking, there's so many disruption opportunities, if we want to call it that, around, aren't they?
Yeah. So absolutely. I'll try and give a quick example. So, and I mentioned it briefly on our last conversation, but the global windmill industry for wind energy was largely dominated by three firms for almost 20 years, the two biggest being GE and Siemens, a US and a German-based company. And the smaller players in the world couldn't succeed effectively. And so along comes a small startup. There's actually one based in the Netherlands, one based in the US. Two small startups, but I'll focus on one, that gave away for free a sensor that could be put on these windmills. And what that did is it gave for free the smaller competitors in this market the ability to produce and deliver the same exact services that a GE or Siemens could. So up comes a small little startup that is able to now dominate the world global industry by gaining access to the data coming off the windmills to make a more efficient servicing and provide a lower cost to customers. Yeah. You think you couldn't compete globally against the Siemens and windmills? Along comes one company, prove you wrong. That couldn't have happened 20 years ago because we didn't have the cloud to send the data on that gave them the ability to do real-time performance monitoring. So that's just one of many examples. I know I talk about it in some length in the book, where small little startups can now compete and disrupt others. And Malcolm, the real important point here, which I want to make sure we make, is in the book I talk about what happens when you have an existing competitor, an Alphabet, an Amazon in the US as an example, and throughout the globe, of course, who own a point of strategic control. How do you compete when they own the dominant market share? How do you start to think about disrupting or disintermediating their business? And I actually outlined 7 strategies for trying to overcome that.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, and I'm really encouraging people to delve into it this strongly, like me. Now, look, Bill's book. Before we do that, let's remind viewers and listeners of your URL, which is Chestnut, or the W is obviously Chestnut Hill Associates. Now, obviously, viewers, you can see that on the screen behind me. But let me just spell out for all our thousands of listeners. It's Chestnut. I'm sure you can manage that one. Chestnut Hill Associates, all one word there, chestnuthillassociates.com. And Bill's book is called The Carrot and the Stick. I think I'll bend it down a little bit there so that the light hasn't hit it. The Carrot and the Stick, Leveraging Strategic Control for Growth by Dr. William Putsis and published by Rotman-UTP. Bill, before we move on, what does Chestnut Hill Associates do?
So thanks for asking, Malcolm. So we do a combination of strategic consulting and education. So I have a number of online programs, courses that people can learn from. We're a different kind of consulting firm in that I'm an academic by background, and I always tell the joke, of course, and I don't mean to insult any consultants out there because the consulting business does some awesome work, but there is an old joke about what a consultant does is they're the person who comes in and tries to steal your watch. and sell it back to you over and over and over again. Now that's not fair. So it's only a joke. But what I like to do and what we do as an organization is we like to tell organizations, my goal in coming in to work with you so that you don't need us anymore. So I'm working with 2 firms now on game theory exercise, one of the areas that I talk about in the book. And part of what we do is educate the executives on how to do it themselves. So I need to come in once. And next time they need to do it, they don't need to call me back anymore. So as a group, we try and push that philosophy so that you and your people can be empowered to do it yourself. Yeah. And we cover most areas of business, from the value chain and carrot and the stick that you see there to segmentation to game theory and other things like that.
I totally empathize with that. I always feel that my job is to work myself out of a job. Yeah. Bill, time for part 2. Now, I love your thinking and the carrot and stick approach, and I know it works. But, and here's the big but, all too often strategies are never executed, or they fail because they're incorrectly executed. That spells to me weakness and possible disaster. Can you explain how your carrot and stick thinking needs to be applied if it's to be truly successful? And no holds barred in this one, Bill. Let it rip.
And Malcolm, it's interesting because I watch you as you ask questions, and the way you subtly but clearly build on the previous question is masterful. I love it because this answer follows directly on the question that you just asked about ChestnutHillAssociates.com. What I believe really strongly is that in order to get good execution, you have to engender buy-in. One of the things that I often see executives do in companies, and I'm working with one right now, who I obviously won't name, where they come up with a strategy from the C-suite or come up with a strategy from their chief strategy officer and tell people to go implement it. No one's motivated if you're trying to implement something that someone else came up with. So with another organization that we're in, I'll be with them actually Thursday, Friday of this week, is what we have is every representative from every functional area, from each of the verticals of the BUs, as well as the functional areas, finance, sales, marketing, accounting, are all in one room as we start to develop the strategy. So they're part of developing the strategy. So when you have to go execute, they came up with it, and hence they're motivated to go out and do it.
Yeah, so like a pre-buy-in, if that's it.
Yes.
Yeah, I love it.
And Malcolm, you're entirely right. Is an old, what is it? It was Mark Fields, who I know used to be CEO of Ford, was famous for popularizing this term that I think was coined by Peter Drucker, that strategy eats culture, culture eats strategy for lunch. And what Mark was really good at pushing was that it's not that culture or in this case, the execution, it's not that that's more important than developing the strategy. You need both. But if you have the right strategy and the wrong culture, the wrong execution strategy doesn't matter because it never happens.
Yeah.
So I would argue that, one, if some of your listeners are thinking about examples where the strategy hasn't been executed to your satisfaction, think about what you did to engender buy-in of the people that needed to execute, rather than tell them what they simply needed to execute. And that, I'd argue, is absolutely crucial to success for most firms in practice.
Yeah, I totally agree. You avoid totally that the Moses syndrome, of chucking the tablets of stone down from above and get on with it.
And there's so many different ways in which you can try and make that happen.
Yeah.
In having people come together to execute in practice. There are countless examples of companies that had good strategy, but were also too slow. So one of the things I push really hard is the use of game theory. And I argue that game theory is thought to be this, and it is in theory, very elaborate thing that involves advanced mathematics, and it does. But in practice for business, it is essentially a series of very elaborate decision trees. Here are the things we can do. What might the rival responses be? And that enables you to move nimbly and quickly. If people have a playbook to move and move quickly in response to what happens in the marketplace, they actually can make it happen quickly.
Brilliant. Yes. Agility and adaptability. Thanks, Bill. Now for part 3. The first time I met you, I loved your wide range of the moment thinking, today's thinking. And I'm going to let you have free reign over my viewers and listeners. Well, those who want to stay ahead of their competitors, of course. I want you to challenge my audience with your thinking, goad them into action, and tell them what their carrot can be.
So what I push really hard on in sessions that I do live, Malcolm, is give examples of companies that were disrupted. And there are countless, the cliched ones of Kodak and Blockbuster from years ago. But I give them examples and quote Jeff Bezos, who says, when he was asked, are you worried about being disrupted? And he says, I'm not worried about being disrupted. I know I am. And my job as CEO is to have that happen until after I'm no longer CEO or when I'm dead, is his quote. So every company is being disrupted. The challenge you have is to try and stay ahead of that curve. So if I think about what you need to do to make that happen, I'll throw out the challenge. One, in the book, I talk explicitly about what a strategic control point is in an industry. I'll give you one example of a company that, sort of 2 counter examples. One company pre-identified a point of strategic control. It was Owens Corning that I was working with, and they were able to access that point of street. It happened to be something called granules on roofing materials. And to this day, they're the dominant player in that market. Another firm, who I won't mention because they didn't succeed, didn't identify it until it was too late. So to your viewers out there, every industry, every company faces a point of strategic control of some sort. And it doesn't mean it's exclusive to large companies. I like to tell them, we work often with small businesses. It could be a location on Main Street. I have a startup that I'm in the middle of right now. We're early stage, less than a year old. And in my business is going to be scale. The real question we have, if we can get scale quickly, and that we'll learn if we're going to be successful or not. If we can get that scale quickly, it's going to be real hard for someone else to break that in our little niche that we're trying to build. Are you doing a startup that scale is crucial? And maybe you don't need to make money off of the bat. If you think about strategic control points, they're not often profitable in their own right. The challenge I'll throw out to your viewers as well is, do you have something that you think is a point of strategic control, and are you trying to make that a profit center? I'm going to argue, if you are, 9 times out of 10, you'll be wrong. But when you think about the Android operating system on phone, Alphabet never tried to make that a profit center. That Google, before they became Alphabet, wanted to make it a data access point so they can make the data the profit center later. Those examples of windmill sensors, they weren't making money on the sensors. What is the modern day version of give away the razors to sell the razor blade, or give away the printers to sell the cartridges in your industry?
Yes.
If you're not thinking that way in your industry, someone else will be.
Yeah.
And that at the heart of the hyper-competitive nature of what we're going on. So that's number one. The second part, and there's going to be 3 parts of this. The second part is the notion of the carrot. Carrot and the stick. I've read you mentioned the stick. So obviously your readers could guess the carrot's coming next. I'll give an example. I worked for a bank, 26 visits to Haarlem, just outside of Amsterdam, ABN AMRO. A great bank, very over the years done some really good things. But they were having a lot of problem in the commercial lending side, because every time the client-facing people inside the company would come up with a new solution for a client, the risk management part of the bank would veto it. And they ended up losing a customer. And what they found was that the incentives inside the bank, so vertically aligned incentives mean outside the company as well as inside the company. Those risk management people inside the bank did not have the same incentives as the customer facing. And they ended up losing accounts inappropriately. We know with banking industries, you have to hopefully have a reasonable balance of higher return, higher risk, and safe, lower return. That portfolio is what you manage. And they were capped at the top end because they weren't able to get the approval of the inside part of the bank, so those incentives weren't aligned. And so in your organization, do you have all the incentives aligned? You get in behavior what you incent, number one, and then are they aligned outside, as we mentioned before, throughout the value chain? And then the third one is probably the most important one, which is actually the whole second half of the book. And that is, how do you think about leveraging a point of strategic control to other markets? The notion of an ecosystem. I often say, don't think products anymore, think platforms. And once you think platforms, stop thinking about platforms, think about ecosystems. So I tell an example of the book, in the book at the very first, excuse me, the shaking there. Very first couple pages about Alphabet being able to get margins in the insurance industry in Latin America, in Peru, and the complaint of a CEO of a major company that was given to me a number of years ago. And they're not in the insurance industry, they're in the data industry. Yes. But because they own the data, they're able to leverage it on knowing what drivers are driving fast or slow or in or not within the limits of the law. And so they have built an ecosystem around an operating system, that Android operating system. Now, I'm not suggesting to your readers, I'm sure 95 plus, maybe all of your listeners out there are not as big as Alphabet and able to do the same thing. Some of them may be working in those positions, but if you're not cognizant of others that are trying to do that, you may be behind. And if you're building a startup, you have to think about what you do in your core market extends to other market opportunities, because you could be leveraged out of those other opportunities. So those three things: first, in your market, to your listeners, are you really thinking about what those points of strategic control, and are you making that a priority to access? Number two, are you seriously thinking about how you align incentives inside the organization as well as throughout the value chain? And then probably most importantly, how are you thinking about what you have in your core markets, extending to adjacent markets that are connected, and hopefully leveraging points of strategic control in your core market?
Brilliant, Bill. Yeah, you've certainly been making people think there, and importantly, take off the blinkers. I've been fortunate enough today to have secured precious extra time with Dr. William Putsis, author of this book, The Carrot and the Stick. I trust everyone, both watching or listening, have made a note to not only get the book, but to apply the thinking and be fit to compete. Thanks, Bill.
Malcolm, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.